Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk a little bit about the books that I've been reading this week. Yeah, I hope you're all having a good week so far. It's been a pretty fun reading week for me, and I hope you're keeping really well. So let's get talking about those books. So first up, it's a bit of a two for one. It's two books that are related, and that they are both by Abi Daré. They are The Girl with the Louding Voice and So I Roar, which is the follow-up book. And I was basically planning on reading And So I Roar anyway for the Climate Fiction Prize for their long list. And in doing so, I was sort of looking up this book and it did say, okay, well, this is a sequel to The Girl with the Louding Voice, which I'd been meaning to read for a long time. And the more I saw, I think somebody I know on Goodreads mentioned explicitly, oh yeah, so this book is also like directly following up, as in the events of And So I Roar are several hours pretty much after The Girl with the Louding Voice. So it kind of makes sense to read them both. And in terms of sort of as a concept, essentially, The Girl with the Louding Voice has us following, I think, is it Dunny? Yes, a Dunny, who is this young girl who's very plucky and fiery and full of spirit. And people around her basically have very strong ideas of what her life is going to look like. And so, you know, a big part of the story is them basically telling her, no, you can't do that. You can't go to school. You can't do this thing. And her finding a way of overcoming and making sure it happens. And she's just this really interesting character as well, because all of her sort of parts, basically the whole book really, is written in her voice, which is a slightly incorrect English, sort of slightly it's basically this really idiosyncratic way of her talking that's very, very her. It's English with this very interesting tilt to it, and it's just really fun because it's quite, you get into the rhythms of how she speaks throughout the book, and it really just sort of, it works. There's something about her that is so utterly compelling because she's so sort of focused and singular. And then in And So I Roar, we pick up from some quite dark events at the end of The Girl with the Louding Voice. And so much of this book is really around the big parts of what's happening in her life. So the chapters are all a time until midnight when something is due to happen. And so we know through all of the book that something major is about to occur. And we know that there's a tension because at any moment something could change and wreck the whole thing. And so I found this really compelling, particularly because in this book we have another character who alternates chapters with Aduni. And so as a result, we have chapters in sort of more standard English, and then we break back into Aduni's English. And it's really, there's something quite fun about juggling both of those. So yeah, I found them really utterly compelling as a set of books, really full of heart and full of love. Aduni is such a sort of firecracker of a character, this absolutely driven, compelling young girl. I think she's 14 or something. Yeah, 14. And so she's just utterly in that kind of rambunctious teenage stage, but there's something more to her. She's not just this teenage figure who can be easily pushed to one side. She will fight for what she wants, and she is very, very plucky in all the sort of fun ways, really. Next up, something entirely different, Bear by Marian Engel. And this is a book that for years a few people were like, you've got to read this, it's slightly wild. And I say slightly, there's a lot. So essentially the whole core idea is a woman goes to this fairly remote location, and she is due to be essentially stewarding, to some degree, a house while she's out there. She's due to be there for a long while. And she's warned when she moves there that there is a bear. And the bear has been kept as a sort of pet. So it's not as much of an immediate threat as otherwise it would be. But there's still this odd thing of there is a bear in your back garden, basically. I don't want to spoil too much because a lot of this book is just something you have to experience. But essentially she's quite a hermited sort of person. She's quite, there are quite a lot of allusions early into the book that she hasn't been touched or hasn't been loved for a while. And so she starts to develop sort of romantic and sexual feelings for this bear. and haven't, we've all been there. And it's just one of those things where it's utterly wild in the book because it's kind of hard to describe without really going into it. But you get quite lengthy scenes that go into detail about what's happening there. But it's clear, I think this, as much as there's the kind of shock factor and the kind of absurdity or silliness behind this potential idea, there's also something quite tragic, I think, in this book, that she is so starved for love and attention that the idea of this huge beast is something that she starts to almost project emotions and feelings onto. So she's feeling quite alone. So she starts to think, well, this bear really understands me like nobody else. The bear probably doesn't, but there's some aspect where she feels that. And I just think this book is kind of genius, but also just wild. I was reading this on the train and I kept on having moments where I was like, I really hope people sat at either side of me are not looking at the page, because it's, particularly during lengthier sex scenes, there was a lot of that where I'm like, if they look over, I mean, fair play, that's on them if they're sort of snooping over my shoulder. But if they are looking over my shoulder and reading this, they will be wondering what on earth the person next to them is doing and what they're reading. So yeah, it's wild. It's kind of great at the same time. I really loved it. I thought it was just a lot of fun. And there's something really beautiful about the character portrait of this really hermited figure that I think is done with such deft touch, because she's both very hermited and this kind of tragic figure, but there's something slightly absurd and there's something slightly beautiful about parts of it as well. Yeah, really interesting book. I'd be really keen to hear other people's thoughts on this. Next up, different again, but another book where reading it on the train proved to be a strange moment because of some of the language of it. My Tender Matador by Pedro Lemebel, and this is translated by Catherine Silver. And this I thought was really fascinating and really beautiful and such an odd gem. A Chilean friend of mine recommended it to me because this is a sort of a modern kind of Chilean queer classic in some ways. It's a book that deals with particularly Chilean politics and things around revolution and Pinochet and various other things. And so there's this really dark undertone and overtone, really, to a lot of the book, where we know that there is this ever-present threat in the story. And the book does eventually lead up into parts of the revolution and parts of political activity. But we start with this slightly odd, almost very film-like opening scene, I think, where characters are sort of watching each other from a bit away. And particularly some of the language at first, I had to double check that it was definitely coming from a queer author, because otherwise it would have felt almost... it's one of those things where, a queer author using certain words or slurs kind of can work versus if it's someone not from the community, right? And it was it was one where I found it really difficult to read on a train, because anybody looking over would see the F slur quite a few times in this book. And yeah, so it's a really interesting book, though, I think, regardless of that, because this dawning and sort of blooming relationship between the two characters here, who are, what are their names again? There's one who's mostly just known as the Queen, and a man called Carlos. And they start this slightly odd relationship that feels... there's almost a sort of... It almost mirrors the political situation in its own way. So there's a sense of violence or threat or aggression sometimes in the ways that they talk about each other or to each other. But there's also this incredible tenderness and beauty. And so the book plays this off against each other, where there's this harshness everywhere to be seen, and they're trying to carve out a little moment of softness. Sorry, my phone cut me off there. But yes, just as I was saying, I found this book so compelling for the way it works. It's just so bold and brave, and it just has these beautiful, beautiful passages, but also just this laser sharp focus on the political realities of the characters in this book, and I just found it so interesting. Yeah, I really, really enjoyed this, and I'm very glad I ended up reading it. And last but not least, I read Ultra Processed People by Chris van Tulleken. And this I thought was a really interesting piece of nonfiction. It's essentially about ultra-processed foods, as the name probably suggests, and it does a lot more than I thought it might do. So typically, and maybe this is typecasting other books I've seen, a lot of books will do the first step of perhaps talking about ultra-processed food and why things like that might be bad, and particularly looking at the ways that food production has grown and changed over the years. So, you know, that there are now many, many food products that have multiple things in there that we wouldn't otherwise recognize as food, right? They're there for texture or for flavor, but they're not otherwise food. It's not like a natural thing. And I think this book does a really good job of doing that first bit, as many other books will do, of really doing the science around that. But I think what elevates this book to being even better is the way that it then really creates a commentary on the ways that humans consume food, the ways that we interact with food, and what that looks like in terms of companies. And so it both focuses its ire at companies who will intentionally do things that essentially harm the health of others, although it also tries, I think, to understand why those pressures exist. That for many companies and food companies, there is a real sense of having to do the absolute most for the absolute least price, and as a result, it looks at the various things that might be added into a food to give it the illusion of being the right texture, whilst also not kind of being proper food, or not being exactly the product you need. It gives, for example, at one point the idea of something like peanut butter. Well, if something like 5% of that peanut butter is a product added only to give it the feel of peanut butter, because that thing is cheaper than the peanuts themselves, then it throws into sharp relief what it might be to have that kind of food. It's a really interesting piece of nonfiction for this, I think, exploring the kinds of things all around you. It's made me quite conscious of it, particularly as a vegan, where I think a lot of vegan replacement things are often formed of many different products. You know, there are many where it is just, hey, instead of this thing, it's tofu or it's chickpeas or it's whatever. But there are some where it's like, okay, here are 14 different science and lab engineered things to make you some food and make it feel like the meat thing that it replaced or whatever. But I think what's also really fascinating about this book is the way that it comments more generally about food habits and the reasons people do this. And I think so often the conversation around things like ultra-processed foods or whatever tends to be from quite a judgy perspective of, why are you eating all this crap? You can choose not to. And although there are choices, I think he, in this book, does make it really clear that a lot of those choices are hampered for us unless you are particularly wealthy or are able to be in certain food environments where you might not need to rely on ultra-processed foods as often. And I think he also talks quite interestingly about a general culture that surrounds food, so that food has become slightly deprioritized, particularly, I'm speaking for the UK, in terms of how we appreciate things. So instead of it being part of more of a routine to go and buy the products, to go down to your local farmer's market, go down to your local wherever, feel the products, choose which potato you want, choose which tomato feels the ripest, and go from there. It's a lot more of a situation of, I have very limited time, I'm going to get the things that I need, and food has become more of not a chore, but a thing that just has to be done, and you are trying to cut those corners where you can. And so I think he's very cognizant of that throughout this book, which I think is what elevates this to being a really interesting piece of writing, because it, I think, tries to explore that issue from many different sides, rather than just sort of wagging a finger and saying UPF bad and you're bad if you do it. So I think this is a really interesting, really, really interesting book, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts as well on it. So those have been the books that I've been reading this week. Take care and speak to you all very soon. I hope you're keeping well. The weather is slightly miserable again, but we carry on. We're in, apparently, I think in Fool's Spring, as it is often called, where we just had the moment, well, we had Fool's Spring recently where it was sunny and nice, and now we're back to remembering that we're kind of in winter and it's dark and it's a bit miserable and wet, but all good apart from that. I hope you're keeping well. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.